Hey, let me ask you something. Did you ever come home from school as a kid, let yourself in with a key you kept on a shoelace around your neck, pour yourself a bowl of cereal, and just watch TV until your parents got home? No note, no check-in call, no one tracking your location on an app. Just you, the hum of the refrigerator, and 3 hours of unsupervised existence. If that sounds like your childhood, there's a very good chance you're a Gen Xer. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, you grew up in a world that, by today's standards, would seem almost recklessly unstructured. And here's the thing most people don't realize. That experience didn't just shape your memories. It fundamentally rewired how your brain developed, how you relate to authority, how you handle stress, and why you sometimes feel like a stranger in a world obsessed with overcommunication and emotional handholding. Today, we're going to get into the actual psychology behind what it meant to grow up the way Gen X did. Not to romanticize it, not to trash it, but to genuinely understand it. Because there's a lot happening beneath the surface of that latchkey kid with the shoelace key, and it's more fascinating than you might think. Let's start with the world that created Gen X, because context is everything in psychology. The 1970s and early 80s were a period of massive social upheaval. Divorce rates were climbing. More mothers than ever before were entering the workforce. The cultural script that had held families together in the post-war era was being rewritten in real time. And children? Children were largely left to figure things out. Not out of neglect in most cases, but because the scaffolding that used to support families, extended relatives nearby, stay-at-home parents, tight-knit neighborhoods, was quietly dismantling itself. Psychologists call what happened next a kind of unintentional autonomy experiment, and the results were genuinely complex. Here's what's interesting about the developing brain when it's given large amounts of unstructured time and independence. It doesn't atrophy, it adapts. Neuroscience tells us that the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, risk assessment, and problem-solving, develops in response to the challenges it actually faces. When you're a 10-year-old alone in a house for 3 hours, your brain is being asked to regulate itself constantly. Are you hungry? Figure it out. Bored? Find something to do. Scared? Work through it. That's not nothing. That's actually a form of low-grade cognitive training happening every single afternoon. Psychologist Peter Gray, who has spent decades researching the relationship between free play and psychological development, argues that unsupervised childhood experience builds something that structured environments simply cannot replicate: intrinsic motivation. The ability to self-direct, to initiate, to decide what matters to you without someone else telling you. Gen X didn't just develop this in theory, they lived it as a daily practice. But let's not pretend it came without a cost, because that would be dishonest, and you deserve better than a highlight reel. When you grow up in an environment where adults are consistently unavailable, even lovingly, even unintentionally, your nervous system learns something. It learns that you are the primary person responsible for managing your own emotional world. Psychologists refer to this as insecure attachment in some cases, but more broadly, it shapes what's called emotional self-reliance. And here's where it gets nuanced, because emotional self-reliance sounds like a superpower, and in many ways it is. But it also means that a significant portion of Gen X grew up with very little practice in actually asking for help, expressing vulnerability, or trusting that someone would consistently show up for them. Think about how that plays out in adult life. If you're Gen X, you might notice that you find it almost physically uncomfortable to be seen as needing something. You might be the person in your friend group who offers support brilliantly, but deflects it when it comes your way. You might be in a relationship where your partner says, "Just tell me what you need," and you genuinely don't know how to answer that. Not because you're broken, but because that particular emotional vocabulary was never really taught to you. You were too busy teaching yourself how to operate the microwave and resolve arguments with neighborhood kids without adult mediation. There's also something worth saying about the relationship Gen X developed with authority. When you grow up largely outside of constant adult oversight, you develop your own internal compass earlier than most, which means by the time you're an adult and a boss is telling you to do something a specific way, there's a part of your brain that quietly goes, but is that actually the best way? Gen Xers have a reputation for being skeptical, even cynical, and it's not accidental. Psychologically, it's the natural output of a generation that had to evaluate situations for themselves from a very young age. They didn't have parents narrating every experience for them. They formed their own conclusions. This is also why Gen X tends to have a very specific relationship with pop culture, particularly the darker, more ironic strains of it. Punk rock, grunge, the deadpan humor of shows like Seinfeld and The Simpsons, the literary nihilism of authors like Douglas Copeland, all of it resonated because it matched an emotional frequency that Gen X already carried. The world is messy, adults don't have it figured out, and pretending otherwise is a kind of lie. That worldview wasn't pessimism for its own sake, it was the honest output of a generation that had seen behind the curtain early. Now, here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The research on resilience, actual psychological resilience, shows something counterintuitive. Moderate stress and challenge in childhood, especially when the child has some agency in navigating it, can produce stronger adaptive capacity in adulthood. Psychologist Emmy Werner's landmark longitudinal study on resilience followed children through adversity for decades and found that those who developed internal resources, self-efficacy, problem-solving, a sense of independence, tended to navigate adult challenges with remarkable stability. Gen X, as a cohort, scores high on exactly these traits. They tend to be adaptable in ways that genuinely surprise younger generations. They've already survived instability, a difficult work environment, an economic downturn, a sudden life change. These aren't alien experiences. Their nervous systems have practice. But here's the question worth sitting with. Just because you adapted doesn't mean the adaptation was entirely healthy. Some of what Gen X calls being fine is actually suppression in disguise. Some of what they call not needing much is actually a deeply internalized belief that wanting more connection, more support, more acknowledgement, is a form of weakness. And that belief, while it helped a 10-year-old survive an empty house, isn't always serving the adult those kids grew into. If you're Gen X and any of this is landing somewhere specific inside you, that's not an accident. It's pattern recognition. Your brain knows its own story, even when no one has ever told it back to you quite this clearly. What makes this generation so genuinely interesting from a psychological standpoint is that they exist at this particular intersection, raised with too little structure, now living in a world with perhaps too much. They became adults who can figure almost anything out independently, but sometimes struggle to let other people in. They're often the most capable people in the room and the loneliest at the same time. They're fiercely loyal to the small circles they trust because they learned early that big, diffuse safety nets are unreliable. And there's something quietly beautiful in that, even if it's also sometimes painful. If you grew up this way, what your childhood gave you, underneath all of it, was proof that you could handle things, real things, hard things. That kid who came home to an empty house and managed every single day, that kid was building something. Not the childhood they deserved, necessarily, but a self that was real and tested and surprisingly durable. The work now, if there is any, isn't to become someone who needed less. It's to give yourself permission to need more, to recognize that the emotional vocabulary that was never taught can still be learned, that resilience doesn't require isolation to stay intact, that being capable and being cared for are not mutually exclusive, even if your childhood made it feel that way. You figured out a lot on your own in that quiet house, but some things are actually better figured out together. If this resonated with you, maybe because it's your own story, or maybe because you love someone whose story it is, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part of this hit differently? And if you want to keep exploring the psychology behind why we are the way we are, stick around. There's a lot more to unpack.